G'day guys, Mackie with the Outer Circle, and today I have another What Broke the Fans. This time, it's for the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit strategy battle game. My oh my, guys, this is a big one. How do you condense nearly 20 years of fail into one video? Okay, fail is a harsh term, because this actually started out something pretty pure, pretty good. See, I'm going to break this down into little sections. Each one I'm going to give it a little title, because that's the only way to sort of have this flow with any sort of real sense. So, first little section here, in the beginning. In the far-flung 90s, they decided to make the Lord of the Rings movies. By the time they rolled into the cinemas, I was in high school. It hit at just the right time for me, as pretty much all the specialist games that were coming out of GW were on their way out, and only Mordheim and Inquisitor were left on the shelves in the stores that I went to. This was also a time where my financial earnings were pretty much non-existent too, so a new game with a low model count compared to late 3rd edition was very inviting. The trailers for the movie, of course, started coming out, the hype built up, the kits came out, and the game was a lot like 1st and 2nd Ed 40k, with more emphasis on hero abilities. As far as systems go, it was very easy to learn, but difficult to master. The movies, of course, dropped one by one and were a massive hit, as I'm sure everyone's aware. I mean, if you're not aware that Lord of the Rings was a huge hit, you're probably living under a rock. The models themselves were gorgeous. The Perry brothers knew their shit, and the slow dribble was fine, since the first book, Fellowship, had a low model count. You could buy a fantastic starter box with men and elves on one set of sprues and Moria goblins on the other. It gave you plenty of models to play the game with. Gave you 4 men with shields, or Numenorian men, 4 elves with swords, 4 elves with bows, and you had a 4-4-4 ratio of goblins with spear, sword and shield and bow, I believe they were. Better still was the price. It was only $36 for 24 models, at a time when a 10-man tactical squad had just made the jump to $40. The table created in the GW store I attended, the Greensboro shop, was a weathertop table, and for the time it was absolutely stunning. It was topped off with a resin model of the weathertop ruins that was actually, I believe, made by Forge World. It's one of the early sort of resin terrain pieces that was done. Now, the Fellowship themselves came out, as you can sort of see here. It was this kit which is currently sold out because, why wouldn't it be sold out? A lot of models are no longer in production from that time period, which is something I'll get to later. But yeah, it was a fantastic, very detailed box at the time. I mean, you've got to remember what these were all in proportion. Hands suited arms and faces, and 3rd edition hands were very big and clunky, and sculpting has come a long way since then. We take it for granted now, but back then, yeah. Anyway, not only did you get the Fellowship of the Ring and that kind of thing, but all the characters that came out were in white metal. There was a Ringwraith box that contained the 9. There were specific sets of scenarios in the main book, and some scenarios actually came out and included alternate sculpts. These included the attack on Weathertop, which came with Aragorn with a flaming brand, 5 Ringwraiths, as well as the 4 Hobbits. There was the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, which came with Gandalf and the Balrog. There was the Battle of Orthanc, which had Gandalf and Saruman and a little Palantir, and it was like its own little mini-game. And there was also Amon Hen, which came with a bow-firing version of Lurtz, and had an arrow-riddled version of Boromir slumped on his knees. Poor Boromir. Now, to top it all off, the first book included many heroes, and we're talking right down to the heroes from the Last Alliance, including all-time favourites of mine, Gil-galad and Elendil, who, in the lore, are pretty fucking amazing dudes. Although Gil-galad doesn't get too many mentions, Elendil is like a, bro tier. Later on, the Fellowship actually had Sauron himself included in he came out as a one model expansion pack with a dead Elendil and Isildur standing next to his father's remains, holding the broken shards of Narsil above him, which is a pretty cool little box. It was only like $40 or $50. It wasn't that expensive. And it came with its own full set of scenario rules and everything for Sauron and the Last Alliance battle, all printed for free in White Dwarf. All in all, great value for money, a great system, and everyone to know what the future held. Next, the Two Towers. When another year had passed, along came the trailers for Two Towers. Naturally, with this came the new starter set, complete with 12 Riders of Rohan and 24 Uruk-hai. This box set was amazing. Trust me, you had to be there to know how great it was. The rules were comprehensively expanded. Numerous FAQs were released, again, free in White Dwarf, right? All the previous book's heroes were carried over and updated, as well as being rebalanced where they needed to be. So you didn't have to go out and buy an old copy of Fellowship just to play the heroes from it in the Two Towers. Now, better yet, they actually released siege rules. And on top of this, they even released a Fortress of Helm's Deep as a pre-painted resin fortress. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't really overpriced either, considering. In fact, you can still pick them up online now, although they will set you back quite a pretty penny, up to like $600-700. But they are spectacular fortresses, even if they are rather small. Now, many battles were had by me and my friends. Games Workshops, many of them actually built scale versions of Helm's Deep, so you could recreate the epic battles that were actually from the movie, which is, of course, the best part of playing this game. You got to recreate the battles. Could you hold off the Horde of Uruk-hai? And on a 4x4 table, you can fit a Horde of Uruk-hai on, trust me. The thing was, you got things like a 2-part campaign with a first assault on the Deeping Wall, followed by an attack on the Hornburg. You had heroes carrying over the injuries from the first round or the first part of the campaign, and stat changes, things like that. So they're depleted might, depleted will, depleted fate, all that kind of thing. If Aragorn lost 2 out of 3 wounds, then he went into the next game on 1 wound. It was fantastic. They also introduced rules for wraiths on fell beasts and people riding monstrous mounts, and in general the scope of the game grew. The Two Towers was the perfect sequel to Fellowship as a game, not just as a movie. Next up, we had The Return of the King. Hopes were pretty high for this one, and we got an intro to Gondor in the second film, and the fully plated armoured warriors, and that looked fantastic. I thought for sure they were going to come out in white metal, because the detail on them at the time they had a lot of detail. Thankfully, though, they came out in plastic. And, I've got a big heart on for Numenorians and Gondor, so that was great for me. When Return dropped, I was not disappointed at all. We had another fantastic starter set, and GW actually used brainpower when they brought this one out. You see, originally Orcs only came in white metal. Now, Orcs are a horde army, and a horde army in white metal is a wallet killer. Nobody runs them. Instead, everyone just ran massed cave troll and goblins, right? With the occasional orc hero. Return of the King fixed this, because not only did they make them plastic, but they put them in boxes of 24 for only $36. A bargain and a half, right? Now, of course, all the minis from the movie came in, and sadly, there were no fiefdoms or a lot of the Harad, things like that were all missing from the initial drop of the Return of the King book. But I noticed something. On one of the pages, it was something I didn't quite understand at the time. I'm just looking now, because I actually have a Lord of the Rings Return of the King rulebook sitting right next to me, so I'm going to try and find the page. So, bear with me here. Okay, so, I briefly just paused the video, went off air, grabbed my Lord of the Rings book for the Return of the King, and I'm looking through it now. On page 152, there's a fight scene going on in Minas Tirith streets, and you can see a bunch of Gondorian troops, and they've got very long spears. They're wearing long black robes, and they've got no other depictions in this book. And it really puzzled me at the time, because if they were conversions, why would they put them in the book? The game's not known for a lot of conversions. So these guys standing near Gandalf around the fountain sort of puzzled me. And I was like, who are these guys? Well, quickly, I discovered the truth. The truth, of course, was expansions. The aforementioned robed warriors were the Citadel Guard, and the first big expansion book to come out was the Siege of Gondor. In it, they had the Gondor siege machines, Mordor siege, a bunch of units which, despite being made in time to be photographed for the main book, were instead shoehorned into a supplement. Okay, fine, whatever. I got characters like Beregond, I was happy, right? I mean, Moradon orcs, the main orcs that actually are at the Battle of Minas Tirith, Citadel Guard, trebuchets, all that kind of thing, all got thrown into this book instead. A few months later, along popped another supplement, Fiefdoms, and this one had the Knights of Dol Amroth, Warriors of Lossark, etc., and all the hordes of Harad, Suladan's hosts. The book was filled out in the fluff and tied up all the loose ends left over from the films, I thought. Well, I was wrong. Endless expansions. You see, the Dwarves got an expansion. It was actually probably the very first expansion canonically, because I believe it came out after the Two Towers book, at a stretch of the imagination. And their book was like Shadow and Flame, or something to that effect, I believe it was called. And it was all about Balin and trying to retake Moria from the orcs, or, well, goblins. That was alright, because it fleshed out the dwarves as a faction, and everyone loves dwarves, right? And you can't have a fantasy setting without a dwarf army, so it was good to finally get them, and it added some more heroes for the dwarves. It added Balin, Foy, gave rules for Khazad and Waters, the last King Durin, that kind of thing. I think it was Durin the 7th. So, yeah. But the next thing that happened was we hit a new low point. We got the Shadow in the east, and basically power creep was setting in. We had canned rock up, we then got an Arnor book, we got all these new customized rules for ring wraiths, we even got the Necromancer and a Hobbit book tie-in expansion, which covered like the fall of the Necromancer and the battle for Dol Guldur and all that kind of thing. Basically, the appendices, the Silmarillion, was all mined by GW in the endless desire to harvest money. It probably would have been fine if it was not for the aforementioned power creep and the fact that the game had become too sprawling and unregulated. See, players could take a badass hero who simply ruined the balance, such as the Shadow Lord, who made all the bows shot at a target within 6 inches of him only hit on a 6. Could you imagine this when he was surrounded entirely by trolls, and now you had to try and kill all of the trolls in close combat? It sucks. Good luck with it. You know, sometimes it could be just as simple as putting down the table infinite goblins. Sure, Aragorn is a beast, but Aragorn will not cut down 80 goblins before he goes down himself. Something had to be done. Legions of Middle-earth was the next thing that happened. Games Workshop decided to try and make the Lord of the Rings into a mass infantry game, much closer in style to Warhammer Forces of Battle than a skirmish game. This was their attempt at it, and it just failed. For whatever reason, there was no huge desire to play a very different version of the game. And in my opinion, the simplified rules took away from the epicness of the setting. People liked the individual heroism of the soldiers, the skirmishing nature of the game. By turning it into Warhammer, basically, with big movement trays full of guys, it took something away for the people that were playing it. It was not a popular system. Eventually, they balanced the game. They came up with a fix for the absolutely broken game, and it was this. It was a two-part fix. Firstly, the factions which had been previously introduced in the Legions of Middle-earth was brought in, and they also added a hero-to-warrior ratio of, I believe, 1 to 12, where the infantry could only be fielded up to a maximum of 12 per hero. On top of this, you are now limited to a single faction and their allied lists. So there was no more picking and choosing heroes from a range of a dozen lists to make the perfect Death Star. No. The equivalent of the game prior to this was taking an unbound 40k army with Araman invisible buffing a unit of pimp gene stealers, whilst a Calexis assassin runs around in front of them, stopping you from intervening. There was just crazy shit like that going on, right? So they finally put an end to it, and it was fantastic that they put an end to it. I'm straying a little bit off topic here. Also, I mentioned before that the Shadow Lord was overpowered. He's not overpowered, but in certain situations, his ability can become overpowered. I should just make that note, because someone in the comments will probably pull me up on it. Anyway, back on topic. Lord of the Rings was now in a pretty solid place, but the problem here was it was no longer getting new miniatures. It had long since lost the White Dwarf support. It had long lost the consistent FAQ and errata, and it was pretty much stagnated. There was no more movies to build hype, and the appendices had just been mined for short supplements that Games Workshop just quickly threw out, and they sort of did the IP a disservice. Things started to go more wrong when the Perry brothers left GW to start their own miniature company, the Fabulous Perry Miniatures, I believe it's now called. And they stock a lot of historical conversion bits for those who are actually curious, by the way. Now, the old rules writing team was gone too. Matt Ward had now developed into the 40k cheese writer, and Alessio Cavatore had gone off to Mantic. The game was pretty much dead and dying. So, what happened next? Well, the Hobbit film. Or films, if you will. Hobbit films. Glorious, we said at the time. The game's going to be revitalised. What do we get? Well, book 1 drops, and we get sweet fuck all. We got even less units than the Fellowship book. We actually had combined this with all new game weapon stats, things like that, the ability for monsters to throw infantry and other weird stuff. It became a lot more complicated to play. It wasn't the quick, run in, fight values, game over sort of gameplay that we were used to. Because now there was actual individual weapon stats. Oh, you have a hammer. Well, you can do a crushing blow, or you can do a piercing blow with the pick side of the hammer. And it became a bit of a clusterfuck. Worse yet, they didn't bother to add in any of the units from the Lord of the Rings like the previous rulebooks had, and instead told you to go back and get those books with their massively out-of-date rules, and some of these books had been long out of print. So, great work again, GW right there. If you want to field, say, Elendil, good luck, because you can no longer buy the model, and even if you could, you'd have to go buy a copy of the Return of the King rulebook if you actually wanted to get some rules for him. And he'd also be very overcosted next to the Hobbit models, because power creep. You see, the new movie meant new miniatures. And yes, there were new miniatures. They were over double the fucking cost in many cases. And model numbers were often cut down in the boxes. The cost went through the roof, and the tiny dwarf characters in horrifically bad first wave fine casts could cost up to $40. I mean, it's just shocking. I actually put an example up here in the video. In Azog's Hunters, there's Hunter Orcs on Felwarks. Fantastic looking kit. $70 for the Felwarks. But if I go over to the Isengard army list, you can actually see Warg Riders. A little bit older kit, sure. Same model count, $43. So you could just use Warg Riders counts as Hunter Orcs, and you may as well, because you'll save yourself basically 50% nearly. Oh yeah, okay, someone out there is going to complain. It's like 40-something%. Whatever. But point is, this sort of shit happened a lot. Same thing with like Mirkwood Sentinels in Book 2 versus Elven Rangers, right? A lot of this bullshit price creep. And yeah, no, that was one of the worst things they did. Right. What the fuck was probably the most quoted phrase that I actually heard from gamers over that one, to be honest. But yeah, look, some of the characters, such as Azog, had their models based on the movie production stills. And when the production creature changed, nobody changed the books or the sculpt. So this guy here, the Keeper of the Dungeons, has variously had about 3 or 4 different rule sets. He's been the Keeper of the Dungeons, he's been a Gundabad captain, he's been a Dol Guldur captain, and he was originally the Azog model. But, yeah, obviously Peter Jackson changed it. So, yeah, when he was released, he was Azog. Also, the starter set was lame. It's the same one that's out now for The Hobbit, and nobody likes it because it's full of fleshy goblins, and flesh is a pain in the ass to paint. the Goblin list is too restrictive because it's only the same unit repeated over and over again. In fact, many of the armies are in the Hobbit game. Just the same unit, lots of it. Just spam that unit, you'll be right. Whereas Gondor offered, like, say, for making a spear, sword, and bow version of the same model is not the same as, like, Gondor, which had, like, Citadel Guard, Guard of the Fountain Court, Gondor Rangers, Gondor Warriors, Gondor Knights, right? There's a big variety in one sort of faction, and in the Hobbit game, we just didn't get that variety. Most of the armies only feature about 7 units, and half of those are characters. Anyway, the last thing to point out there was the fact that the dwarves themselves, the 13 dwarves, the company of Thorin Oakenshield, simply too costly to run as a unified force, and you needed to run them as a unified force to get all the various buffs that they provided as Thorin's company. It was not a good list. They were slower moving, they didn't have the ranged power, and things like trolls just ate them for breakfast. But, we thought, it's okay, Hobbit 1 is going to be it's going to be light because it's mostly the start of the adventure, right? All the battles and the adventure happens in the second one. Oh, wait a minute. It's a trilogy. Oh, okay. Well, same small rulebook. In fact, we actually kept the rulebook from the first film, but you now had to add a second rulebook supplement, which is like a 20-page supplement book, which is, again, sitting on the shelf next to me. This new rulebook brought in, again, very few new units, and it retconned the Dol Guldur expansion pack with the defeat of the Necromancer somewhat. But somehow that's still canon anyway. Fucks me how. Legolas was released, and he was better than ever, far, far superior to his Fellowship version, because reasons. Toriel was solid, and Thranduil puts Aragorn and Elrond to shame somehow, despite being some silly woodland elf. I'll point out here that in the fluff he's just kind of a nobody, and apparently now he actually has 2 very different models. The one is the expansion pack version from the Necromancer supplement for Lord of the Rings, where he's more of like a mage with elemental abilities and a staff and that kind of thing. And in the Hobbit films, he's like a samurai blade master. So somehow both are canon, and you can use both. It fucks me how. And he's not even the worst example of this sort of funny thing. So yeah. Eventually we got to film 3. You got Gondobad Orcs, more Wood Elves from Mirkwood, and new improved tankier versions of the Dwarves, of the company of Thorin Oakenshield. You also got a pretty epic and amazing and overpriced Smaug, but hey, it's epic. Awesome looking model. Lake Town's force is a joke, nobody plays Lake Town, and of course another fuck up because Bard uses the black arrow firing Dwarven Windlance instead of a bow. Because Peter Jackson is an eccentric filmmaker who changes his mind at the last minute and fucks everyone around because of it. So instead of him using a bow, he's got this massive war machine that when he takes the black arrow, apparently he's got to lug a fucking ballista around the battlefield. I don't get it. The worst repercussion of this was the fact that Games Workshop had pretty much resigned themselves to not supporting the game. The main antagonists from the Battle of Five Armies were not fleshed out at all. There was no Iron Hill Dwarves, no motherfucking badass Dane Ironfoot, who also has another canon character who shares a sculpt with Balin, of all things, and who has his own another canon alter ego. This was a faction who the players lusted for, and it was withheld, and on top of the mounting cost of these armies and fine cast crap, Hobbit was pretty much dead. I'm just going to take another moment to point out that, yes, here is another version of Dane and of Balin. Now, well, actually, other way around. That one is Balin, and that one is Dane. So, obviously, Dane isn't a mohawk-wearing badass here with an awesome hammer. He is some dude with an axe. And what they did when they sculpted him was they just cut the axe out, or didn't sculpt the axe there in the first place, and made the hand pointing, and got rid of the cross piece on the helmet protecting the nose. Put the axe in the other hand, and now you've got Balin. So the exact same model used. And of course, Balin is completely different looking to the Balin in the Hobbit games, because these were designed 5 years before the Hobbit films came out. I know it's nitpicking, but I just had to point it out. The fact that these are still technically canon within this game series, and you can use them both. You just can't use them on the battlefield at the same time. But yeah, it's retarded, right? Well, luckily, Forge World has come to the rescue. Forge World was given the task of rebuilding the specialist games. First thing they gave us was the Iron Hills Dwarves, and along with that, new releases for the good and the bad, with forces with like the Ogres and Berserkers, a few other units. Overall, they are supporting the system, and one last blip has been detected on the life monitor. There are rules coming for them. So, where next? Well, there's a long way to go. The first thing is that they need to rewrite and condense everything into a single rulebook. With all the characters and all out of production Lord of the Rings era units and books put together, it's all got to be collapsed. It's got to be collapsed into one book. It's got to be rebalanced. It's got to be tweaked. Next thing they have to do is they actually have to go back and they have to recast all those miniatures that they've stopped producing, because their rules are still current, the rules are still used, but you just simply can't get them. Putting together armies of things like Numenorians is impossible, because you can't get either of your two heroes, Elendil or Isildur. You definitely can't get them on horseback, right? You can't get Numenorian archers. All you can get is some Numenorian swordsmen and some Numenorian spearmen, and if you want the Numenorian swordsmen, you have to also buy them in a box full of high elves, and you get 8 high elves for every 4 swordsmen. So things like that are a clusterfuck, and it's got to be fixed. Lastly, they need to bring back into production some of the out of production character figures from other factions. So you're talking like your fiefdoms, things like that, where only part of the army is available for purchase. I did just sort of cover off on this a second ago, but it does need reiterating. It's not just key factions, it's also supplemental factions and supplemental characters. So, my final thoughts. I've immensely enjoyed the game over the years. I still enjoy it to some extent. I've played it ever since the beginning, and I've actually had to downsize the collection over the last 2 years, when I realised I'd probably never get around to finishing it all. Right now, I pretty much only run Gondor / Numenor and the fiefdoms, and a bit of a Mordor force on the side for counterbalance. Because it used to be back in the day that good could only ever play evil, evil could only ever play against good. When you went to a tournament, you needed to have a list for good and a list for evil, and you had to run basically 2 small factions. So yeah, I still keep to that tradition, because it's a good thing. Plus, if you've got a friend over who actually wants to play the game, the models are there for them to try it out. Now, I love the game still. I just can't justify the ridiculous prices that are actually associated with the Hobbit miniatures. I definitely can't justify playing it in the power gulf that exists in the game right now. Until they fix these things, my 300 plus model Gondor army is probably not going to leave the cupboard. And if they ever do a Silmarillion, well, let's say if that one gets a GW game tie-in, the horn of Helm Hammerhand will sound in the deep one last time. I was not going to produce this video before the Dark Eldar, I should say, video. There's what broke the fans, the Dark Eldar in the works. That one has been hard, so I sort of put it on the back burner and focused my efforts on this Hobbit one. I know it is a longer video, coming in at around a half an hour, but a lot of the things here just need to be said. The game itself was great, it was great for probably 6 or 7 years, and then it just got thrown under the bus. It's like they just stopped caring about it, gave it no support. They just mined all these expansion packs in the most simplistic way, and you know, it really sucks, because this game was great. You know, it was what Age of Sigmar is now. You know, it was this fun little skirmish game that, you know, whether you're into Age of Sigmar or not, I don't care. You know, the point is, it was a skirmish game with a cheap buy-in, and it was great for new people coming into the hobby. But the minute they stopped giving it exposure, nobody gave a fuck anymore. And, you know, no one wants to play a game with zero support from the company. So, that's where we ended up at. I'd love to hear your thoughts below, especially Lord of the Rings Hobbit players, because I know you're a small community now, but you are dedicated and loyal, and this video is just for you. So, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.